In a moment, we'll speak with Senator JD Vance. We have never met before, but we have many friends in common who tell me that he is smart and he is talented and he is more than capable. None is perfect, no, not one. That's what the good book says. And the American people are forgiving if we ask. Let's welcome GOP Vice Presidential candidate Senator JD Vance from the great state of Ohio. Welcome, Senator, and thank you for joining us. I've heard from many women, most of whom are conservative, and they would very much like to vote for President Trump and you, but Senator, they are disappointed. So nuns and priests aside, do you agree that there are people who very much love this country and are invested in its future, but they also happen to be childless?
Oh, of course I believe that, Trey. And if you look at the full context of what I said, it's very clear the Democrats have tried to take this thing out of context and blow it out of proportion, which is what they always do, Trey, because they don't have an agenda to run on themselves. And if you look at what the American people are most concerned about, Trey, it's not an out-of-context quip that I made 3 years ago. It's the fact that Kamala Harris, the border czar, opened the American southern border. It's the fact that the Democratic Party has become explicitly anti-family in some of their policies. In fact, you just heard Kamala Harris in a surface clip recently talk about how it was a bad idea to have kids because of climate change anxiety. So really what I'm trying to get at here, Trey, is that it's important for us to be pro-family as a country. Of course, for a whole host of reasons, it's not going to work out for some people. We should pray for those people and, of course, have sympathy for them. I still think that that means we should be pro-family, generally speaking, as a party. And I think that our country has become particularly hard for parents, especially under the policies of Kamala Harris.
All right, Senator, I want to ask you about the other part of that again, is making news. But I'm not asking you because it's making news. I'm asking you more because people are calling me who very much would like to support you and President Trump. Dr. Connie Rice does not have children. Neither does my friend, your colleague, Tim Scott. George Washington did not have biological children, and neither did James Madison. So I think you will agree with me that direct offspring are not necessary to be fully invested in the future of this country.
Of course not, Trey. I do think that being a parent actually has a profound effect on somebody's perspective, and we should honor and respect that. But there are a whole host of people who don't have children for a whole host of reasons, and they certainly are great people who can participate fully in the life of this country. And that's not what I said, Trey. If you look at what the left has done, they have radically taken this out of context and, in fact, aggressively lied about what I've said. What I do think is true, Trey, and this goes to the heart of what I was talking about 3 years ago in those comments, but it's going to be something I continue to talk about, is that the left has increasingly become explicitly anti-child and anti-family. They've encouraged young families not to have children at all because of concerns over climate change. They've suggested that people who do have children are somehow being selfish, when I think being a parent is actually the most selfless thing that you can do, and again, really does transform your perspective. So this is not a criticism and was never a criticism, Trey, of everybody without children. That is a lie of the left. It is a criticism of the increasingly anti-parent and anti-child attitude of the left. There's one more thing I want to say on this, Trey. I think a lot of parents and a lot of non-parents look at our public policy over the last 4 years and ask, how did we get to this place? How did we get to a place where Kamala Harris is calling for an end to the child tax credit? How did we get to a place where we were masking toddlers years into the pandemic? I think it's because we radically underrepresent the perspective of parents in our public discourse. I'm going to keep on calling that out because I think it's important for parents to have a voice, and I'm proud to be on the ticket with President Trump, I think a real defender of parents and families.
All right, you served in uniform. President Trump says he can end the war in Eastern Europe. Can he do so, in your judgment, without ceding territory to Russia? And if so, how?
Well, Trey, I think that President Trump has a remarkable ability to engage with world leaders, in part because he established deterrence. People are afraid of him, and that is an important part of actually conducting public diplomacy well. If you look at the past 20 years of American history, Russia invaded another country when Bush was president, when Obama was president, and when Biden was president. The reason they didn't when Trump was president is because the president had actually established some real deterrence. So I think he's going to take that respect into a negotiating posture with both the Ukrainians and the Russians. And I think he's going to be able to find a resolution very quickly to this conflict because, look, we all agree Russia shouldn't have invaded Ukraine. But if you look at the reality on the ground, both the Russians and the Ukrainians are exhausted by conflict, and they respect President Trump. I think between those two, you can actually find the real genesis of a deal. And President Trump is the ultimate negotiator. He's shown that multiple times on the world stage. I think he'll show it again if we give him another shot in January, which I expect the American people to do.
Senator, when people are treated unfairly, the temptation is to respond in kind. But our justice system is symbolized by a blindfolded woman. The media portrays President Trump as bent on retribution when actually he forgives people for things they've said and done in the past. Can you assure voters a Trump-Vance justice system will be used as intended and not as a weapon of revenge or lawfare as it currently seems to be used?
Yeah, of course, Trey. And you know, I was critical of the president back in 2015 and 2016, and he has looked at me as somebody who can contribute meaningfully to the future of the country, so he asked me to be his running mate. This is not a vengeful guy. The media lies about Donald Trump more than anybody I've ever seen in public life. He's a good grandfather. He's a good father. He likes the American people and loves this country, and this is why he's doing it. As he said repeatedly, his retribution will be the success of the country. You compare that to the Harris administration, which has tried to throw the guy in jail, and I think has led to an escalation in political rhetoric that is unfortunately increasingly leading to violence in our country. Just take, Trey, one other point here. What the president said after he was nearly killed almost 2 weeks ago, he called for national calm and unity. If the media lies about Donald Trump were true, he would not have responded to an assassin's bullet as he did. And I think for a lot of Americans, whether they're pro-Trump or maybe more skeptical of him, but open to voting for him, don't believe the media lies. Believe the picture that you saw a couple weeks ago of a guy who stood defiant in face of an assassin's gun, but also called for national unity. That is a special human being, and I think we have an opportunity to make him president again.
It's also the guy who took a pass on Hillary Clinton when he won in 2016. He said, no, we're not going to go after her. But you're right, that is not the story that is told about him. Senator JD Vance, the GOP nominee for vice president from the great state of Ohio, thank you for joining us on a Sunday night.
Thanks, Trey. Take care, man.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.